All right, what's up, y'all? Roy here, and you were listening to the Clems with a Z podcast. Now, today's episode was originally a Substack article that I just wanted to flesh out and kind of put it on the podcast. So, welcome, here we go. So, a few weeks ago, I got a text message from an old friend who listens to the podcast. It wasn't hostile, it wasn't sarcastic. And honestly, it felt genuinely curious. It was the kind of message that comes from someone who's been paying attention and trying to understand where you are. But the question hit something in me like immediately. In the text message they wrote, "It seems like in your deconstruction journey you've come full circle back to Christianity. What draws you in that direction?" And before I think I really even knew what to say, I got nervous. Not thoughtful, not reflective, like genuinely nervous. I could feel this old reflex firing up in me in real time. It's like this need to explain myself before I'd even fully processed what I actually believed. The urge to make sure that they didn't misunderstand me, to clarify, to defend, to get ahead of whatever assumption might already be forming. And the more I sat with it, the more I realized that it wasn't like just the text itself that was really bothering me. It was what the question revealed in me. Because if I'm being honest, there is still a part of me that feels deeply uncomfortable existing in this strange middle space that I found myself in. A place somewhere between evangelical Christianity and spirituality, between skepticism and openness, between leaving something behind and still finding parts of the story that are worth sitting with. And sometimes it feels like both sides get uncomfortable with that. Like Christians are often okay with deconstruction as long as it eventually leads you back to where they'd hoped that you'd land. And people in deconstruction spaces are often okay with your journey until you say something that sounds a little too spiritual, a little too faith adjacent, a little too open to mystery or meaning or Jesus. And it can feel like no matter where you go, there's still pressure to arrive at the quote unquote correct conclusion for whatever crowd you're standing in front of. Like it still doesn't fully count unless you believe the right things in the right order with the right language. And I think part of why that text message hit me so hard is because I still don't fully trust myself sometimes. I spent so much of my life needing other people to tell me where I stood with God, with truth, with belonging, and with whether I was doing okay. And even now, after all the writing and therapy and questioning and rebuilding, there's still this huge desire in me for external validation, this deep longing for someone to look at me and say, "You're okay here. You're allowed to be here." Because I really wasn't taught how to give that permission to myself. I was taught how to align, how to explain myself, how to stay acceptable to the group, how to make sure I didn't drift too far outside the boundaries of what people around me considered safe or true. And so when I got that text message, my first instinct wasn't actually to answer the question. My first instinct was to make sure I could justify my existence in the space I currently occupy. And honestly, I think that reflex says more about what high control religious systems do to people than any theological position I could possibly give in response to the question itself. And so let me be honest about something first, because the word back is doing a lot of work in that text message, and I don't want to just let it slide by like it's neutral, because it's not neutral for me. Because for me, coming back would have looked like something really specific. Coming back would have meant returning to the ICOC, to the International Churches of Christ, the high control religious environment that shaped me from childhood. And when I say high control, I don't just mean strict beliefs or strong convictions. I mean a world where belonging felt conditional, a world where certainty was rewarded and questioning carried consequences, a world where your job wasn't really to explore or wrestle honestly with truth. Your job was to align. And if you grew up in something like that, I know you know exactly what I mean, especially if you grew up in that same church. You learn very quickly which questions are quote unquote safe and which ones make the room uncomfortable. You learn how to read people's reactions, how to monitor yourself, how to adjust your language, and how to soften your doubts before they become dangerous. And eventually, you stop needing someone else to police you because you learn how to do it yourself. And so that's what back means for me. Coming back would have meant returning to that entire architecture, not just the church building, not just the Sunday services, but the whole internal world that came with it. A version of God that felt less like love and more like surveillance. A version of spirituality where I constantly felt observed, measured, and evaluated. Like somewhere above me, there was this divine scorecard keeping track of whether I was doing enough, believing enough, obeying enough, and performing enough. And honestly, like most of y'all, that fear shapes so much of our inner world growing up that sometimes I know we and I still catch traces of its hiding underneath things. It's that constant feeling of like, what if I get this wrong? What if I believe the wrong thing, say the wrong thing, question the wrong thing, become the wrong thing? That was the atmosphere. So when people hear me talk about spirituality or Jesus or scripture now and assume that I've come back, I think they're imagining something more softer and simpler than what the word actually carries in my body. Because for me, back doesn't mean, or doesn't just mean Christianity. Back means surrendering my autonomy again. Back means handing over my inner authority, my questions, instincts, voice. Back means returning to a version of faith where belonging was tied to agreement and safety was tied to conformity. And if that's where I had landed, trust me, you would know. It wouldn't look subtle. It wouldn't look like thoughtful curiosity or nuance or rebuilding. Pretty sure it would look like collapse. It would look like someone spending years untangling fear and then under the weight of uncertainty or loneliness or grief, slowly reshaping themselves back into the familiar form that once controlled them. That's not what happened. And I think this matters beyond just my story because I don't think people always understand what the word back means to people who have come out of high control systems like this. Whether it's a church, a political ideology, a family system, a social movement, whatever it is, when you leave something that shaped your nervous system, your identity, your sense of safety, returning to it isn't just a casual thing. The word carries weight. It carries memory and fear and the emotional cost of everything you had to unlearn in order to survive outside of it. So yeah, when someone says it seems like you came back, what people often don't realize is that somewhere underneath that sentence, what someone hears and what I hear is you return to the thing that hurt you. And I need to say this clearly that I did not return to the thing that hurt me. And what I've done is something in a lot of ways so much harder to explain because we actually have a pretty good language for leaving. We know words like deconstruction, disillusionment, walking away, breaking free, religious trauma. We have a lot of language for the collapse. But I don't think we really have good enough language yet for what happens after, for what happens when you leave honestly, question honestly, heal honestly, change honestly, and still find yourself circling parts of the story you thought you were completely finished with. Not because you're being manipulated or you secretly want certainty again or that you're sliding back. Because once fear loosens its grip, curiosity sometimes returns as well. And that's where I found myself, not back, somewhere far more complicated than that. Honestly, and I think it's why it's been so difficult to explain, is because both religious spaces and deconstruction spaces still tend to think in binaries. You're either in or out, awake or deceived, saved or lost, orthodox or quote unquote dangerous, deconstructed or reconstructed correctly. Everybody still wants to know what team you're on. And I think that's part of why that text message rattled me so much. Because I realized there's still a part of me that feels like I need permission to exist outside of a tribe. Like, if I can't be clearly categorized by a group, then maybe I become suspicious to everybody. And honestly, that's where the reflex kicks in. And so here's something that I keep coming back to. When I got that text message, I felt the need to explain myself before I even knew what I wanted to say, before I had language for my position, before I had even figured out what my position fully was. You think that would be easy, right? Or before I had processed the question emotionally. The first thing that showed up was defense, justification. It was like a reflex. It just fired up almost instantly. And the more I sat with that, the more I realized that it's not a neutral instinct. It's a trained one. Because I grew up in an environment where your standing always felt provisional, where belonging had to be earned and then re-earned and then earned again. You didn't just get to exist somewhere peacefully. You had to demonstrate constantly that you deserved your place there. You had to show your work, show your loyalty, your alignment, and that your thinking still fit inside this approved boundaries of the group. And if it didn't, maybe nobody said it outright at first, because high controlled environments are often a little bit more subtle than people imagine. Because it's not always screaming pastors in public humiliation. Sometimes it's just a shift in tone, a conversation after church, a leader, quote unquote, checking in, a look on someone's face when you ask the wrong question a little too honestly. But you feel it, and you quickly learn where the edges are. And when your entire world exists inside that environment, your friendships, spirituality, family structure, sense of identity, support system, the threat of losing belonging doesn't feel theoretical. It feels like existential. And that's the part people outside systems like this sometimes don't fully understand. Because when belonging becomes fused with survival, your nervous system just adapts accordingly. You become hyper aware, hyper vigilant, and you just start editing yourself in real time. You rehearse conversations in your head before they happen. You anticipate criticism before it arrives. You learn how to soften your questions before even asking them. And you learn how to explain yourself before anyone asks for any type of explanation. And after enough years of doing that, something strange happens. The external system slowly becomes an internal one. And that's the part that I wish someone would have had explained to me earlier. Because leaving the environment is not just the end of the story. Leaving the church building is not the same thing as leaving the architecture the church built inside you. And honestly, that's the thing that's taken me years to fully understand. Because for a long time after leaving the ICOC, I still carried its voice within me. Not literally, not consciously most of the time, but internally. The voice that said, you need to be ready to explain yourself. The voice that said, your legitimacy can still be revoked. The voice that said, you do not get to simply exist somewhere honestly. You need to justify your presence there. And that's what's wild is eventually nobody else even has to enforce it anymore because you're doing it yourself. That's how deeply the system shaped me, and systems like this shape people. The monitoring just becomes internalized. And honestly, I think it happens in way more places than religion. I mean, churches do it, sure, but politics does it. Social movements do it. Families do it. Internet culture definitely does it. And there's this constant pressure to perform the correct identity loudly enough that nobody questions where you belong. And if you stop performing correctly, people get nervous. And honestly, I think that's part of why standing in this weird middle space that I'm in still feels uncomfortable for me sometimes. Because I can still feel the old instinct trying to activate. That instinct that says, like, pick a side clearly, explain yourself correctly, make sure everyone understands exactly where you stand so they know whether to trust you. And I'm trying to learn how to not obey that instinct automatically anymore. Not perfectly, not all at once, but slowly. Because here's what I'm finally starting to understand. It's that voice, it's not wisdom. It's not conscience. It's not God. And it's not some deep intuition warning me that I'm failing. A lot of the time, it's just residue, like leftover sound of a system that trained me to stay uncertain, self-monitoring, and externally validated because uncertain people are easier to manage. And learning to hear that voice without immediately obeying it, honestly, that's like the hardest work of my life. And that little text message just revealed something in me that I'm still trying to make peace with. The voice is quieter now, but sometimes it still fires. And I want to say something that might land uncomfortable. It all gets policed. Not just Reconstruction, not just religion, not just deconstruction, the whole journey, every stage of it. Every position on this road eventually gets scrutinized by someone who has decided they know what a legitimate spiritual trajectory is supposed to look like and has quietly appointed themselves in the referee of yours. Stay in the church and start asking difficult questions? Now you're dangerous, divisive, a problem to manage. You become, quote unquote, the person struggling. Person leadership suddenly wants to check in with more often. The person people start talking carefully around because your questions are making the room uncomfortable. Leave the church entirely. Oh, now the narrative shifts. Now you're hurt, lost, confused, deceived. You just had a bad experience. You just need a healthier church, a better pastor, a less toxic version of the thing you already left. Because for a lot of systems, your departure cannot simply mean something about this structure harmed me. No, your leaving has to become a misunderstanding, a wound, a rebellion, a season, anything except a legitimate conclusion you arrived at honestly. And then there's deconstruction. First, people cheer. Eventually, if you speak publicly, people resonate. They message you. They thank you for saying the things they were too afraid to say themselves. And honestly, a lot of that connection when people have reached out has meant the world to me because there really are people out there carrying enormous amounts of pain and confusion and grief from these environments. When someone finally names what they've experienced, it can feel like oxygen entering the room. But even there, there are still expectations. Unspoken ones sometimes, expectations all the same. Stay in the lane, land somewhere acceptable, become secular, become anti faith, become fully detached from anything that resembles Christianity closely enough that the people cheering for your deconstruction stay comfortable with where your story landed. And if you don't, and if you say, actually, I still find parts of the story meaningful, if you admit I'm still curious, or you say, there are still things in the teachings of Jesus that I find beautiful, compelling, or true when I hold them up against real life. Watch how quickly the tone can shift. Because sometimes people get really nervous. Suddenly you've regressed or you didn't finish the work. Suddenly people who were celebrating your deconstruction start wondering if you're slipping backward. And what's strange is the people still inside the church actually aren't cheering either because you're not back enough. You're not repentant enough. You're not aligned enough. You're not certain enough. You're engaging with the text on your own terms instead of the community's terms. And honestly, I think that can feel just as threatening to high control environments as leaving altogether. Because genuine autonomy is so hard for systems to categorize. And systems really like categories on all sides. And that's the thing I kept noticing over and over again. Everybody wants to know what team you're on. Are you in? Are you out? Orthodox, progressive, deconstructed, reconstructed, Christian, ex-Christian, spiritual, secular. People want categories because categories help them know if you're safe. And I understand the impulse more than I wish that I did. Because I think a lot of us are just scared of ambiguity. Ambiguity feels unstable, it feels uncertain. And uncertainty makes people really anxious. It does for me. But honestly, I think some of the deepest growth in my life has happened precisely in the places where I stopped forcing myself into clean categories just to make other people feel comfortable and myself. Because the truth is, there is no position on this journey that fully escapes judgment, no landing place everyone approves of, no version of your spiritual life that won't disappoint somebody somewhere. And if you spend your whole fucking life trying to arrive at a position that keeps everyone comfortable with you, you'll lose yourself trying. Honestly, I think that's why so many people eventually stop talking publicly about where they really are. They go quiet. I get it. I really fucking do. Because it's exhausting having your spiritual life treated like a public position paper that anyone with an opinion gets to critique. It's exhausting feeling like every sentence has to survive cross examination from multiple tribes at once. And for a long time, I think part of me still believed that I could just explain myself clearly enough, carefully enough, nuanced enough, then eventually everyone would understand. But that's not actually the goal anymore for me. Because here's what I'm slowly starting to realize. A lot of the policing has very little to do with you or me. It's usually about what your journey means to the other person, the person who needs you to stay fully deconstructed. Deconstructed. Boy, those are tough words to say sometimes. Often needs your deconstruction to validate their own. The person who needs you to come back often needs your return to validate their decision to stay. And neither side is necessarily trying to be malicious when they do this. A lot of this is deeply human. We all look for reassurance that the path we chose was the right one. I do it. It's there. I get it. But when somebody's journey refuses easy categorization, when it doesn't reinforce the conclusions people hoped it would, it makes people really uncomfortable because your story stops functioning as confirmation for theirs. And honestly, I think that's the part I'm finally trying to make peace with. My journey does not owe anybody that kind of meaning. Not the church, not the deconstruction world, not the internet, not an audience. And guess what? Neither does yours. Now, yeah, there was a very specific shift for me somewhere along the way. And I want to be honest about it because I think it was one of the biggest turning points in my healing. But it also wasn't dramatic. It wasn't one sermon, one book, one therapy session, and one conversation where suddenly everything clicked into place and I walked away completely transformed. Honestly, it was slower than that. Much slower. It felt more like when your eyes adjust after walking out of a dark room into sunlight. Like, if you see a movie in the middle of the day. At first, everything is blurry, your vision strains, nothing fully settles. And then gradually, almost without realizing it, you can suddenly see things the way that were always there. And what slowly came into focus for me was this: it wasn't a quote unquote God who did those things to me. And I want to slow down there because I know how differently that sentence lands depending on who's listening. Some people hear that and immediately think I'm making some kind of theological argument. I'm not. I'm not trying to prove God exists. I'm not trying to prove God doesn't exist. I'm not trying to hand anyone a new doctrine. I'm just trying to describe that internal shift in me, a distinction that eventually became real in my body in a way it hadn't been before. Because for a long time, the ICOC and God were fused together inside me, not intellectually. Intellectually, sure, I could separate them long before emotionally I could. But in the deeper places, the nervous system places, the instinctive places, They still arrive together. The doctrine, fear, shame, control, anxiety, the divine, all came in one package. And honestly, that makes sense. If from childhood, right? Okay, if from childhood you're taught this is God's voice, this is God's truth, these are God's standards, this is God's authority, eventually your body stops distinguishing between the institution, the leadership, the interpretation, and God. Your nervous system just fuses them together. So even after your mind starts questioning things, your body still reacts. And that's something I think people outside high control systems don't always understand. Because you can intellectually leave years before your nervous system catches up. You can consciously reject the theology while your body still flinches around scripture, around worship music, around church language, around the word obedience, around the fear of being wrong. Because the fear wasn't just intellectual, it became physiological. And honestly, I've carried that for a long time. I could feel it any time I got close to anything faith adjacent. The tension, this bracing. Like some part of me was preparing for punishment before I even decided what I actually thought. But somewhere in the middle of all the therapy, conversations, reading, grieving, years of sitting honestly with what happened, something started separating. And this is important, okay? Not just intellectually, but I've started to actually feel the separation in my body. The difference between people and the divine, between systems and mystery, between institutional control and spirituality itself. And when that separation finally started becoming real to me, oh man, something loosened internally. Because when I realized it was people, people in the system who built it, enforced it, interpreted it, and protected it, people who were often carrying their own fear, their own wounds, inherited theology, and their own unexamined pain. That doesn't erase the damage, okay? The damage was real. The fear was real. The control was real. The cost was real. But it changed what I understood myself to actually be healing from. I wasn't healing from God. I was healing from a system of human control that claimed ownership over God. And that distinction changed everything for me. Because once that landed, really landed, something happened that I don't know how to describe except as like permission to disagree, not just with the ICOC, but with any interpretation handed to me without examination. Permission to ask or to question ideas I inherited but never consciously chose. Permission to ask things like, wait, who decided that this was the only way to read this? Or who benefits from this interpretation? Or what if this isn't as settled as I was taught it was? And for the first time in my life, I could actually approach spiritual material with agency. I could pick something up and examine it on my own terms. Turn it over, sit with it, question it, disagree with it, keep parts of it, and leave parts of it without immediately feeling terrified about the consequences of arriving at the quote unquote wrong conclusion. And honestly, that was brand new for me because in the ICOC, and honestly, in a lot of high control religious spaces, genuine autonomy with the text wasn't really available because you didn't interpret, you received the interpretation. And then you aligned yourself with it publicly and convincingly enough that nobody questioned your loyalty or your spirituality. The idea that you could hold the Bible in your own hands and bring your own mind, your own experiences, your own doubts, your own questions to the text, that was quietly understood to be dangerous because independent thought destabilizes systems built on certainty. And I think that's why this permission moment mattered so much to me. Not because I suddenly became comfortable with Christianity again. That's way too simplistic. It's not that I suddenly landed on certainty or arrived at some clean conclusion. It's that for the first time in my life, I became capable of looking at spiritual things without fear controlling the interaction, without immediately bracing for punishment, or anticipating rejection, or fearing what it would cost me if I thought differently than the group. And honestly, for some people, that might not sound like much, but for some of us, that sure is everything. And I keep thinking about a house. I love metaphors. Okay. Honestly, this wasn't a metaphor that I came up with quickly. It's one that just I kept returning to over and over again over time because the more I sat with all of this, the more it felt like the most honest image I had for what this process actually feels like from the inside. So imagine a house you've lived in for most of your life, not just a place you visited, not somewhere temporary, home. The only home you really knew for a long time. And because it was the only thing you knew, you never really stopped to ask whether it was well built. You didn't question the foundation. You didn't wonder whether the walls were healthy or whether the structure itself was stable. It was just reality. The smell of it, the routines, the language, the lighting, the emotional atmosphere, the rules you stopped noticing because they had become normal. You didn't stand outside the house analyzing it, you just lived in it. And then something might have happened. Maybe the house collapsed around you. Maybe you burnt it down yourself. Maybe it was a combination of both. And honestly, I think leaving high controlled environments is usually both part survival and part choice. It's the kind of leaving where later on you can't fully tell where desperation ended and decision began. But eventually, one way or another, you walk away from this house. And when you first leave, you don't look back. Because honestly, in the beginning, looking back is way too dangerous, too painful, too destabilizing. 'Cause sometimes survival, well, most times, survival requires distance. And I think for a while that distance was necessary for me. I needed space from all the language, space from the certainty, from the fear, from constantly monitoring myself. So the rubble of what I did just sat there for a long time while I tried to build a life somewhere else. And honestly, that was right for that season. But eventually, and I think this is true for a lot of people, eventually you circle back. Not always and intentionally. Sometimes it happens slowly, quietly. You hear a story again, read a passage again, revisit a memory, hear someone talk about spirituality different than you were taught, or encounter a version of faith that doesn't immediately activate fear. And one day you realize you're standing in front of that wreckage again. And what's strange is what you find there isn't actually what you left. I know that was for me. What you find is pieces, scattered beams, broken foundations, fragments of things you once trusted completely. And some of it is obviously rotten. You touch it and it practically falls apart in your hands. Ideas that once controlled your life suddenly feel hollow, manipulative, fear based, unsustainable. And honestly, some things deserve to stay on the ground, right? And I want to say that clearly because I think people get nervous when you start talking about rebuilding from wreckage. Some things should remain rubble. Some interpretations, some systems, some forms of control, some theologies rooted entirely in fear, shame, and domination, those things do not need to be reconstructed. They need release. And I would never tell someone they need to go back and salvage anything from a place that harmed them. But for me, when I returned to this house, not everything I found in the wreckage was rotten. And that surprised me. It really did. Some things were still solid, not institutionally solid, not doctrinally solid, not this proves the system was right all along solid. Something older than that, older than the ICOC, older than evangelicalism, older than the particular machinery we built around it. And I think this is the part that might confuse people sometimes because when people hear me still engage with spiritual ideas or Jesus or scripture occasionally, I think they assume that I must have slowly drifted back toward the structure itself, but that's not what happened at all. What I found worth keeping wasn't the machinery, it was the story underneath the machinery. A story about a person who seemed deeply uninterested in religious performance and power. A person who consistently disrupted systems that used morality and certainty to control people. A person who seemed more concerned with whether people were fed, seen, included, whole, than whether they had perfectly aligned themselves with the correct ideology. And that story of Jesus, still speaks to me, not as tribal identity or that I finally figure it out, but as a lens, as something I still find meaningful when I hold it up against actual lived experience. And that distinction matters to me because what I did was not restoration. I need that to be clear. This was not actually the house was fine all along. No, the house collapsed for real. The damage and the fear and the control were real. This wasn't renovation or moving back in, and it wasn't rebuilding the exact same structure with prettier language. Honestly, what I've built looks almost nothing like what existed before. Different walls, boundaries, understanding of belonging or authority, understanding of a different understanding of spirituality itself. But some of the materials, sure, came from the same ground. And that's what I mean when I say I didn't come back. I salvaged. There's a big difference in that because I think salvage requires agency, discernment, choice, and autonomy. You pick things up carefully, you examine them honestly, you decide what still carries life and what doesn't. Not because someone told you what you're allowed to keep, but because you finally trusted yourself enough to decide for yourself. And I want to be careful here as well because this is the point in a conversation like it's like where it would be really easy to accidentally turn everything into a sales pitch, let the momentum quietly drift toward, and here's why you should do what I did. That's not what this is. I don't want it to be. I don't want to convince anyone to return to religion. I'm not trying to quietly walk people back towards Christianity with softer language and more progressive vocabulary, because I've seen that happen before and I know how that story goes. This isn't that. And maybe that's because what I believe now feels less like a creed and more like a posture, less like certainty, less like conclusions carved in stone. It feels more like a few things I keep finding to be true when I hold them up against real life. My life, other people's lives, the people I love, the people I listen to, the people who reach out after leaving systems that taught them fear was holiness. And I think the biggest thing I've come to believe is this. A lot of us were hurt by people, by systems, by structures that wrapped human control in divine language and taught us those two things were inseparable. And I think separating those matter. Not because it erases the damage, it really doesn't, but because it changes what you understand yourself to actually be walking away from. You may not be walking away from God. You may be walking away from a system that claimed ownership over God. And those are not necessarily the same thing. I also think the voice that keeps demanding justification from us, the anxious over explaining, the constant need to make our position defensible before anyone even asks. A lot of that, like I said earlier, is residue. It's the sound of old systems still echoing eternally. And I think healing sometimes looks like hearing that voice fire and not automatically obeying it anymore. Slowly and perfectly over time. And honestly, maybe the biggest thing I believe now is this. If reconstruction happens for you, if spirituality still matters to you, if you pick things up from the wreckage, if you leave everything on the ground, it has to be yours. Not your old church's version, not the internet's version, not your favorite author's version, not your favorite podcast hope's version, but yours. Well, honestly, chosen honestly, and arrived at honestly. Because the moment your spirituality becomes primary about staying acceptable to a group again, I think you're probably back inside another performance. And I've spent too much of my life performing belonging to do that anymore. So wherever you are right now, whether you've left behind everything, whether you're rebuilding carefully, whether you still don't know what you believe, or whether you're standing in front of the wreckage trying to decide what stays and what goes, you don't owe anyone a defense for being there. Not the people who need you to come back or the people who need you to stay gone. or the people using your journey to validate their own choices. You're allowed to be where you are, wherever that is. And man, I wish someone would have told me that years ago. So let's go back to the text message as I close all this up. It seems like your deconstruction journey, you've come full circle back to Christianity. What draws you in that direction? But once I got past the reflex and stopped trying to immediately explain myself or make myself defensible, I realized my answer was actually pretty simple. I didn't come back. No, I didn't. I went to the wreckage. I stayed there long enough to figure out what was still solid. I picked up some things. I left a lot on the ground. And what I built from those pieces looks nothing like what was there before. There were different walls, boundaries, understanding of belonging, understanding of authority, and understanding of what spirituality even is. What draws me towards certain things now isn't fear. It's not nostalgia. Honestly, it isn't the gravitational pull of the familiar, of the people that people warned me about when I first started deconstructing. That idea that I'd drift back toward certainty if I wasn't careful. It's something more like curiosity, honest curiosity. It's the kind that you can only really have once fear loosens its grip enough for you to look at something without already knowing what you're supposed to think about it. And yeah, that took me a very long time to get to. Longer, longer than I expected. And I'm still not fully there. The reflex still fires up sometimes. That old voice still shows up sometimes. There are still moments where I can feel myself looking around internally for permission to exist where I currently exist. But I'm learning. I'm learning to hear the voice without immediately obeying it, learning to let the anxiety pass through me without reorganizing myself around appeasing it. And maybe that's the most honest thing I can actually say about where I am now. Not full circle, not back, just somewhere new. Standing in something I built myself from materials that I chose on ground I decided was worth building on. That feels like enough for me. And wherever you are right now, whether you're rebuilding something, walking away from something, sorting through the rubble, or still standing in front of the ruins trying to figure out what stays and what goes, I hope little by little it starts to feel like enough for you as well. Hey, thanks so much for listening to today's episode of Comes with a Z. If something in this conversation resonated with you, I'd love to hear from you. You can email me at clemswithaz@gmail.com or send me a DM over at Instagram at the Clems with a Z podcast page. If you want to support the show, the easiest way you can do that is by subscribing, rating, leaving a review wherever you listen to podcasts. You can share it with a friend, post it on your socials, drop it in a group chat. It all helps more than you know. If you want to support the podcast financially, you can head over to clemswithaz.com where there's a merch store with stickers, shirts, all kinds of little stuff. You can donate directly through the GoFundMe. There's a link in the show notes, and every little bit goes a long way in helping me keep these conversations going. If you're looking for something a little bit more regular, or maybe you're a reader rather than a listener, you can check out my Substack, Devotions for the Disillusioned and Deconstructing. That's where I share short reflections, devotionals, and some extra behind the scenes thoughts that don't always make it onto the podcast. This podcast keeps going because of listeners like you showing up, engaging, and passing it on. So thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And thank you for being a part of this messy middle with me. So until next time, take care of yourselves and each other. Peace.